So I'm just gonna explain to you how to use these blocks, and you can see I centered it down to a wedge. It again gives me kind of a sharp point that it's flat on one side, so I can use the flat side of it if I want to quickly put a lot of mass of the charcoal, or I can use the sharp point, but it kind of self sharpens itself as I keep drawing. And my hand is really close to the paper. Again, I, in a sense, I'm more physical with my drawing in here. But the problem with Conte is that I probably don't want to erase it too much, because if I start erasing it, what will happen is that it will give kind of a burnt look into the paper, where it will smudge it into the paper. Conte has a lot more waxy substance inside, binder. So it actually kind of stains the paper as you smudge it, and it actually gets darker rather than lighter, unlike wine charcoal, where you can take some of the material off. This doesn't work that way. So if that does happen, then you have to use kneaded eraser and pick it up a little bit. Now, if we drag the material lightly like this, then we probably could erase some of that. I needed eraser is pretty old, so I have to really fluff it up in here. And we can erase some of it, especially if it's just on the top texture of the paper in here. So I'm still thinking of the triangulation, and here I'm trying to put the lines that I will only the lines that I will use, because I can't erase. So I'm thinking of this arc. I'm thinking of the chin, the eyebrows, and in the middle is the base of the nose. Now I'm gonna just create a little line like this, and then I'm gonna think about the center line, maybe as the wedge, and how it's gonna come out with this angle in here to the tip of the nose, and then go back at the inner corners of the nose. So we're finding this more like wedge-like form in there. I can see how the eye sockets, what tilt they're going in. This way, here the tilt is going more that way, and we see the cheekbone coming back. It's pretty easy to see here, especially if we just focus on it. Maybe this is too wide. Maybe I have to push it in closer. You can look at the relationship of the brow to the cheekbone. Turn it like this, thinking about the negative spaces in there. I'm gonna think about the mouth barrel on this side and a little bit on that side. So both sides at the same time. And underneath the nose, here's my mustache, the center line, something like that. And somewhere here, we're gonna have the lips. Just gonna keep it fairly loose at this point. I can think about all these tilts, maybe even the corners of the eyes, exactly how they relate to the eyebrow, here, here, here. Also, kind of same angled, comparing to that tilt line in here. Keep it simple. Hairline coming closer over here. We gotta now, unlike vine charcoal, we have to establish the drawing kind of careful. Guess we can't make too many mistakes. And it teaches you to draw in a different way, right? The vine charcoal allows us to be loose and focus on moving edges. This one, we have to establish the shapes in the right places. And we have to think carefully from the start. So in here, we have maybe a little bit of color for the shirt. And I gotta narrow my neck, I think. Let me erase that. It's easier before I have shading to erase some of these lines to clean it up. Because if I did that while the shading, when the shading is already there, it will start smudging all of that. How does it look? It's a fairly good start. So I picked this paper, out of all the papers that I had. It's pretty warm, but it's still fairly neutral. And it fits kind of with the different tones that I have in there. I'm definitely going to use some of these tones for my halftones and for some of the in between my darker line shadows. If I had a darker paper, then I would have to use a lot more white, probably just completely cover all of the, even in this, I'm probably going to cover this with white quite a bit. Yeah. But if I have a too light of a paper, then my highlights would probably just hit the eyes right here. There will be just a few little areas of the white. But this is fairly dark, so I could use a lot more white. So just thinking ahead a little bit. So here I'm going to think of the arc and the shape, the negative shape of the eye socket and the arc of the eyelids. And I'm going to draw the other side at the same time using this edge of my block, barely touching it. So again, resting the nail on the paper just so I can glide my hand and barely touch it. All I got to do is just barely hit the paper. Don't want to be heavy-handed with this. So here it goes down like this. Here's my eye bags, which is the bottom of the lower eyelid. Here's the base of the nose. I'm setting up these major inner corners, the inner corners that come out and the inner corners that are inside the deeper areas. So that sets up a form for me. So this forehead is kind of has a frontal plane. So here's the core shadow around the top of my head, core shadow around this side of the whale's tail, the large mass right here, and a little bit around the temple up in here. Then we have cast shadow from the eye socket and this whole area of the nose. And it ends about here. It comes across like this, comes to the sinus pad, really soft. These shadows are very soft. Again, it's coming from a very broad window. And here are the mustache shape. Trying to get a little bit specific with it. Here's the bottom of my lips. As I draw this, I have to think about all of this areas surrounding it, the proportionate placement of it. Here's this side of the lip, while this one is almost vertical. Almost vertical. Turns a little V shape in here. And a long area comparing to the foreshortened side of the lips. Getting almost done with the setup for myself for all the shadows, still separating light and the shadow in them. thickness of the eyelid, little corner in here, and then I find the proportion of the whites of the eye to the iris, the colored part of the eye, thickness of the eyelid, thickness of the top of the eyelid, thickness of the front side of the eyelid, thickness of the eyelashes. Those are details already, right? And we can find similar thing on the other side. Can't keep it even simpler. Now I'm going to find the corner on the nose. I can start getting it a little bit darker. You can see that it is darker. That inner corner, it's going to come forward, and that's the more important part than trying to dissect the nostril, for example, which is a detail. Again, it's kind of hard to figure out what's light in here. I think this is the core shadow. And it goes through the hairs of the beard, but the core shadow is really on the side. The front planes are in the light. Front of the forehead, nose, the lips, it's all in the light. So the front of the chin will be in the light too. The light is not coming from the top, so this is also the front plane that will be in the light. The light coming from the top, like the nose, we can see that it's kind of in the shadow. So the light is coming slightly from the top, but I think this is still in the light. Maybe there's going to be a little bit of a shadow underneath. There is a coarse shadow on the throat with the cast shadow from the head joining together. Adam's apple has a little triangular plane like this. And I think it just goes over to this muscle in here. So much secondary ambient light in the room that all of this feels light, but it is shadow. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to give it an overall tone. I'm going to keep it light where I think it's fairly light, but I'm going to give it a nice overall tone. I'm going to keep it fairly light in here.
Professor, are we allowed to use a photo this time?
I would prefer you do it from life. But we can talk about it. The advantages of drawing from life again later. Okay. The advantages of doing a demo from photograph is that you can compare what I'm doing to this. So I want to think about what's light, what's shadow, and not mix the two together. So we're not thinking about what is light and what is dark, but rather thinking about what is affected by the light, direct light, and what is in the shadow. So here I have to, again, be careful. I think the front plane of the eye socket is in the light. The side of this is in the shadow. Again, in my picture, it's very subtle. If you create a very strong light source, you don't have to deal with the difficulties of this. Now it's a little bit scratchy, so I'm going to take my sandpaper and see if that's going to help it. It's too much powder in there, and I'm just going to dab it. Think about where the shadow stops. Just give it an overall tone. it's starting to appear, more contrasting tonal masses that tell us what the light is doing to the form. Therefore, even though it's flat, it starts to read as a form in our eye. We don't need to add too many variations of values. We just want to flatly describe what is in the light, what is in the shadow. So after I complete filling in all of this area of the shadow in here, part of the reason is to flatten it, right? So you can use a little bit of the linear quality, but we don't want the texture in there. We want sunlight to come through, so we want to see some of the value of the paper that's lighted in the black chalk. So we don't want it to be too dark. And again, remember that if we start smudging it, it might not look lighter. It actually, even erasing with a kneader eraser, if you start moving it around, it will actually push it into the paper. So we want it to be flat. And then we can start working on variations of different values. Let's make this side of the eye a little bit in the shadow. Now, if you want to switch to a pencil, you could and start doing more of a linear quality. So you can do the whole thing with the your block. And what I do is I hold it by the very back two corners. So it's very loose, not literally just tickling the paper. You want to have loose amount of pressure on there. You don't want to draw with holding on to it really roughly. You're going to have heavy marks on there. Keep it very light. And we can start thinking about where our darker ambient occlusions are, where we can emphasize the foreshadow a little bit, just so in the shadow we develop variations. We develop our core shadows, our cast shadows, our ambient occlusions, and as we do that, the rest of the tone that we established will become our reflected tone. So in here, I'm going to develop a core shadow. You can see that triangular darker plane that's not catching any direct light. No, it catches this reflected light. Core shadow on the soft sinus pads. Extra credit for people who find out what is the name of the sinus pad, so I can call it the official name. I like sinus pads. Here we have the darker tones in here. They're on the side. The reflected light's over here, but not here on that part of the face. Here we see the core shadow on the lip. Let's develop that. And the fact that it's fairly dark all through here. Then we have a different local color for the hair, so we can develop that, but especially on that foreshadow area. So here it might be lighter. Here we see the skin through some lighter hair. So it's not that dark, but on the right side, we start getting some really intense dark tones and some more dense tones. Maxillary sinus. Is that really? Thank you. Not sure who that was. I'll check it out. McCartney. Okay. And here we got, now, I'm not sure if I took it far enough here. And I feel like there's more darker tone all through here. So the reflected light is more on that side. So all of this is still a little bit darker. So I start to compare things. Underneath the head, that's cast shadow. So it's a little bit darker. And then the core shadow on the throat is a little bit darker than the reflected light on the side. You can see the side of the throat is catching a plane of light. So we want to show the muscle of the neck, the sternomastoid muscle here has a light plane and the darker plane. So it has variations. And, you know, it would have been helpful if I just started from the top and moved my way down. So I think this is also shadow, but very light shadow. Here's, I have a little softer core shadow. And I got to show that I have darker hair. Not so dark over here, but still darker, a lot darker than the skin. And definitely darker on the back. Still not too dark, not as dark as some areas on the core shadow because it's being affected by reflected light. And then this hair is pretty thin, so you can see the light skin through this, although it's all in the shadows. So everything is relatively comparing to everything else. And maybe I want to flatten some parts of it. You can see more texture in some areas, less texture in other areas. Just showing a little bit of a difference. And the softer transition here, a little bit of a darker, dare I say, outline. We don't want outlines, right? We don't want them to be strong. I purposely kept this whole side very light in here. I'm going to keep that suggestive. We can come back to it. And let me find some darker tones in the ear. Is the ear in the right place? Corner of the eye lines up with the ear, so I got to make sure that I place it a little bit lower. Where is the bottom? Bottom of the nose actually does line up with the bottom of the nose, the way that we usually see it, but you can see my ear is a bit smaller than going from the top of the eyebrow to the bottom of the nose. Some people have ears that big. I don't. Older people have ears that keep growing, so maybe that would be kind of what people that would definitely have that kind of proportion. And here, this is the dark planes in here, so I can shape it by just literally thinking of the proportions of these dark shapes to the overall shape of the ear. I established where the ear would be, so now I can compare the proportions of shapes to the ear. A little bit of this facial hair on the side. And what are we missing? We're missing hair in here. A little shadow up in here. Little ambient occlusion on the side of the nostril and underneath. Inner corner is a little darker. This is the core shadow plane on the bottom. Join them together, starting to frame the nose. Here's the inner corner above the nostril, maybe too dark, not sure. Here's the ambient occlusion. All of these grooves, they're ambient occlusions. Deeper spaces, less ambient light gets into it. And the bottom of the nose usually gets a little bit of reflected light. We see it on the nostril, but everything below is dark. So here's my little corner. You can think about the tilts, try to make it a little bit more specific, not just like a piggy round shape underneath, right? It's like a bean shape. Pretty dark. And everything below it, including that corner of the nose in here, is pretty dark. Now we got the glow of reflected light on there, but a little too much. Take that down a little bit. So it doesn't look like anything light. We're purposely developing everything in, keep moving closer and closer to my drawing. You can't see it, but I gotta make sure I drove extended arms so I can see the whole drawing in here, even though my drawing is not that big. So it's 3/4 of life size in here. The smaller it is, the harder to get the little details though, right? But we definitely don't want to draw too big because it's hard to control our proportions. Sometimes you want to practice drawing big, or if you're gonna do murals or something. A little line for the ambient occlusion between the lips. The side of this lip is in the shadow. What else do we need? This could be in the shadow a little bit. And maybe a little bit in here. Now with eyes, you got to be careful, right? We established the sizes, but the eyes are so important in terms of the direction for the gaze. Where's the person looking? What kind of look it has? So we got to be careful with the shapes. That's why we develop the outer shapes first. And when you deal with blocking in the internal shapes, we want to be fairly loose with it first. We don't want to have a very strong outline. So we want to be able to shift it. We need to. We develop some overall shapes. The shadow underneath the eyeball. In fact, all of this is in the shadow. So we can join it. Part of this is in the shadow. And there's a cast shadow over here. So let's join this. local color for this eye, just keep it loose. There's shadows underneath here. Now, if this is, again, if you, this is getting a little bit too hard to control, you can slow down. You can put the tip down on the paper where you need to be, and then start dragging slowly. Looking back, measure the proportions. Look at both sides. Maybe you gotta push the corner of the eye, the side of the iris to the side over here. Iris maybe needs to be a little bit more over here. No need to rush, especially since it's harder to fix these in drawings. A little bit of shadow on this side will help it to look a lot more round. Now, another thing you could do is you can get a little stump, paper stump, like with everything else, and either on the side somewhere you make a little really dark stain that you can make your tool a little bit dirtier, and then you can actually draw with the paper stump and have a little bit more like a softer pencil-like control over this. The only thing that I would say is that don't draw in the middle tones, because in the shadows you can have things a little bit more smudgy and formless, less tactile. But in the light, you want to feel the texture. So you want to feel maybe a little bit more of this linear quality, like contour hatching that we talked about. So after you're done with developing the foreshadows, and I think I can go in and develop it a little bit more. I can also think about my environment, but mainly, I don't want to deal with it too much. Maybe I will just address the difference of the clothing in here. Maybe try to create some kind of a different texture. Maybe sometimes even more of that blending for the clothing, just so it's totally different from the way I treat the skin. And it's definitely darker, so that's going to be a good way to separate the two. Darker in the shadow area. Even this, you want to separate a little bit from the background. I'll assume this is going to be the tone for the background, the paper tone, and then the skin would be a little bit lighter in here, so I can use more white. So definitely this needs to be darker, even in the light. So we're comparing these tones. Something like that. And then we can develop a little bit of halftones, like I started with hatch marks, especially on the right side, away from the light. There's going to be more of these subtle gradations, but definitely don't make it too dark comparing to what's happening in the reflected lights in here. So I definitely need some more hatch marks here to make that super subtle, soft transition. And here, maybe use lines going across. The lips are darker, I think, so maybe a little texture coming across this way. And in the corner of the lips, we can finesse some things later. I will finesse it later, but I want to move to the light. And I'm going to do it with the pencil and just going to start blocking it in. I see the strongest highlight on the nose and in the eyes. So I'm going to try to punch it in. I'm going to clean it up a little bit in here before I do this. And I'm going to put it down and push on it to get fairly deep, right? I know that it has to be fairly light. So I have to also figure out where the tip of my tool is. Even though it's sharp, it's not sharp enough. See, I kind of blended them together. And here I want to make some, I don't know what's going on. My eye is very textured, I guess. But definitely just want to get some marks in there. It's way too bright. Oh my God, what's going on here? Comparing to that white paper, it's way too bright. So I'm gonna knock it down a little bit. Now I'm gonna use that as a reference and make the nose one a little bit lighter. It's like a little plane on the tip of the nose, maybe a little bit lighter than these highlights. And then where else do I see it? We definitely don't want to have the same value of light everywhere. So I see it coming through the nose like this. The center of the nose is a plane. See it on here. I see it at the front plane of the forehead. And I needed to separate the forehead from the background a little bit. So I'm going to start rounding it off like this, but I can't have it as an outline. So I have to join those. I'm going to start gradating. It's like contour hatching, but with white. So we're developing the white, similar to vine charcoal when we're erasing vine charcoal into the tone, but now we're building it up with lines. It's a combination of all of these other processes that we dealt with. And we're also thinking of the planes, like the plane of this whale's tail facing towards the light, and then it stops facing towards the light. I can go quickly jump in and here and show a couple of hatch marks for my halftones. Isn't that nice that we have names for everything? We can communicate what is what, and have a little clearer idea of, why things are the way they are. Push that way deeper in here. And I have to be a little bit braver. So I'm very cautious at first. I don't want to mess it up too much, but at some point I have to get to the right value relationship. Now we can see how we're using the paper in the middle tones, how we're using the paper in reflected lights. We're trying to separate the 7 elements of light so they actually create a nice sense of turning of the planes around the form. Now in here, there is a little bit of white effect of the light. I don't think it's coming from the window though. I'm not sure. So I got to be careful not to put that light in there. You're thinking of direction of the light, and I don't want this to appear too light. The eyeballs are also light, but if we squint our eyes, it's not too light. So I don't want to just fill them in with white. So here, I'm going to build this up. And if this is the tone in relationship to the other tones that I will find in here, maybe I'll make the eyeballs a little bit lighter. But not as light as the highlight. Maybe my highlight's not going to be so crazy looking if I make that a little bit lighter. All right, we can make it a little bit lighter. Not too light. The cheek, definitely on the side, is light. My eye bags here, side of the nose, all the planes that are facing towards the light. But I have to now press very carefully because I am, again, just adding a little bit of shading. I don't want to have similar highlights everywhere. Okay, let's get this cheek developed. Sinus pads. None of the light on this side, but a lot different that side. So the tip of the nose now stays the paper color comparing to the maxillus sinus, something like that, right? Sinus pads over here. Side of the mouth barrel is also like a form. So now we're using this paper as a way of shading with white on top of it. So gradating values to the paper tone and then gradating values into the darks away from the paper tone. A little bit of value here. As it gets lower, maybe it's different. Yeah, the chin is just slightly different from the forehead. So I want it to stay more of that paper tone. And here, do we want a little bit of values? Yes, I think we still need to gradate that. Starting to shape it. Where do we feel like the form is not gradually moving around, or too light, too dark? And if we got it too light or too dark, we use kneaded eraser and we press down. What do we have here? Let me see. I don't know, if we made it too light somewhere, like I showed in the eye, we just press down and we take some of that off. Softens it up. Now, there's some people that mix black and white together. What happens is that you create a very distinct, cool, bluish gray tone. And you could use it sometimes. Like I could have used that for the eyes, maybe, mix black and white together, just so it's different. But it's going to be so distinct that you want to make sure that you're using it for a particular element, either a local color of some object, maybe you're wearing a gray shirt, for example, and only use it in the gray shirt. Then it's not going to mix with be confused with anything else. But once you start using it in a part of the face, you have to now find similar areas everywhere. And if you do it in your reflected light and in your middle tones, then you're going to make your light areas affected by the light look very similar to reflected areas. And there it becomes a confusion. That's why I think in Conte drawing more than anything else in the tone paper, you have to separate things very clearly. You only use the lights in the areas of the light. Maybe I can throw in a couple up in here. Very gradual. shadows are different. So here's a little bit of the light right here. I can throw in some for my gray hairs in here. So just gonna add a little bit of texture, but I gotta be careful if I go back again with my darks. I don't want them to start mixing together. So I want to use a sharp point and not push the charcoal on the surface too much. So here I can maybe give a more general tone. And I got to correct some details as I go. And again, if you feel like you're stuck, maybe you're too close to the drawing, sit and look at it for a while and think about what needs to be adjusted, and things will come back to you. You know, there's plenty of things that I missed, and I can go back and say, okay, I missed this part, but I have to slow down and look at it. Let me put a little bit of light on the top eyelid. Now I'm trying not to touch the charcoal, so you can use a little paper, like a vellum or some sort, for example, or printing paper, some smooth paper, and so you don't move it around, or just try to hold a nail or something, and then you stabilize your hand and you can start making some highlights or some thin details, I should say, not highlights. Maybe a little bit in this area. And the more shadow up in here. And more light under the nose, that will frame it. Too much? I don't know. So maybe a little bit of a V shape for the corner of the mouth and around the lip. It's a plane facing towards the light. And definitely on the lips themselves. Let's get these. Maybe the lips a little bit more smoother, reflective surface. They're not exactly wet. If they were wet, they would be definitely reflecting strong highlight. And I think the eye is just too much highlight there. Get rid of it. Also put a little bit of black in between. Might have to even sharpen this a little bit more. So I have a sharp point. People sharpen it to a, very precise pencil-like shapes too, or just use a pencil, I suppose. The darker I make some areas, the more the rest of it will look lighter. So now there's a glowing light inside of my iris. The color is not black. My eyes are kind of a brownish. And this one should be dark in comparison. There's some light, reflected light in here, but a lot of it is very dark. The window into my soul. Window somewhere. here. Dark values of top of the eyelid, the eyelashes. We're looking so close now, right? We're looking into subtle, small relationships. Little fold above the eyelid with half tones, with my eyebrow is a bit lower. Eyebrow changing directions. It's way too high. So I can lighten this a little bit and start working out these areas of transitions, halftones, core shadows, darker areas of occlusions. And we want to feel those reflected lights trapped in between the darker areas. Halftones. A little bit more light. Let's get that light in here. Yes. Kind of stepping back and looking at it. Does it make sense to put this value in there? I think so. Also, my eyes keep jumping, comparing different areas across. So in this one, it's like painting by numbers. You do the drawing first, you do the shadow next, and you develop each part in its own turn. So you don't have to rush through this. You can spend a little bit of time. You just need to do this one drawing, but put enough time developing the different elements in there. All right. Any other questions? I hope I covered it all in most of it. And I'm probably going to work more on developing this drawing from our light lights to middle tones to half tones to core shadow reflected light, right? We want to feel like it's fairly continuous gradation. So I'm going to find these planes in there. I'm going to find this plane and start change that sense of roundness, because this needs to be light but a little bit darker than the front of the forehead. A little bit of the tone up in here. Too much red. So the red is this intense color. Remember, it intensity appears in the local color of the skin a little bit, so it's nice if it's there. But the light lights and the highlights, they use more of the the color of the light. So we're really separating things into highlights, lights, the halftones and middle tones and halftones that are next to the core shadow. And you can, work on smudging things a little bit darker in there, like really work the material in and think of how you can erase that and lift things up just to get, just like with wine charcoal, to get the right tone that you want, the subtlety of the tone. Mhm.